our conversation. First of all, I would like to thank you for writing this fantastic book. I really enjoy reading it. It's an incredible story. And generally, I love reading memoirs and biographies if you see some in the background. But this story is truly amazing. On one hand, you capture it, it reads basically like a fiction story, but it's real life. Everything happened in there.
That's right. And I think when I was writing it, I realized that actually this has a story to it. This has a kind of arc of a story that you would normally see. And actually, I have now optioned the book to be a mini series because
Oh,
it does
great.
feel like something that can be on the screen. So fingers crossed that that's going to happen.
I hope so. I hope so. This was one thought. I thought it reads like a Netflix series. So I was just I was looking, is it already on there? And
Not yet, not yet, not yet, but hopefully it will be.
where will it be? Will it be Netflix, BBC?
So I've optioned it to a production company.
Mm.
A production company with an actor called James Norton, who's a very well-known actor. And they've also signed a writer. So fingers crossed, they will put together a script and then we'll move forward from there. So
If you
that would be very exciting.
if you need some clicks to make it happen, let me know and I make sure that you get some. I think it deserves to be a series. And when we prepared for this podcast episode, I promised to have the book finished when we start our recording. But unfortunately, I haven't. I'm a little bit over halfway through. The reason is every time when I saw an island or something that grabbed my attention, being a man, I used my iPhone and then looked up the places and just wanted to see what you have seen. And on one hand, you describe these beautiful places, and on the other hand, I mean, there are incredible events in there, like a tanker ramming the sailboat, gigantic waves that hit the boat. Today I read about machine gun fights, which was suddenly a really beautiful island. You're in Hawaii, and then suddenly you pull out a machine gun, and I thought, is this really true?
That is one of the really interesting things about the book is we go to some extraordinary places
Mm.
and you're right, lots of people have said to me that as they have read the book, they've gone looking up some of these places because they're very unusual places, places like Al Amsterdam in the middle of the Indian Ocean where we were shipwrecked, or Tristan da Cunha, which is a tiny island off the coast of South America. So lots of unusual places that people have never heard of. Some of them are very beautiful. Al Amsterdam is not particularly beautiful, but Tristan da Cunha is interesting rather than beautiful. Ilha Grande, which we went to, which is near Rio, is very beautiful. And many of the places in the South Pacific are very beautiful. But you then have this contrast between these incredible locations and then what's happening on the boat. As you say, some extraordinary adventures, some of them life-threatening. And then increasingly, as you go through the story, because I go on the boat when I'm 7 years old and I'm trapped on the boat for 10 years, basically, increasingly it becomes a story about how am I going to try and escape from this boat? How am I going to
Mm.
educate myself? How am I going to, have friends, go to school, have a life, given that I'm stuck on this boat? And the relationships inside the family start to deteriorate. So it becomes a real family drama.
Yeah, yeah, it goes. Yeah, I'm not. I think this is in the second half. What we were just talking. So there's a lot to discover in there. And I mean, your journey is remarkable because basically, from what you said, the contrast. Yeah, I mean, your life is basically a life of contrast, if I may say so. You had a childhood spent largely at sea without formal education, if I got it right from the book. And when I discovered your profile on LinkedIn, I saw that you are COO at Exor, which is one of the world's largest investment firm. But that doesn't stop here. Usually, people have one job and that's it. You are also chair in the Heywood Foundation, board member and chair at CNH Industrial, Iveco Group, The Economist, Royal Opera House, Royal Academy of Music, and much, much more. So my first question to you in our conversation is, what drives you? What motivates you to change the world?
Well, I've kind of wondered that myself, actually. There is something about having been trapped on a boat for the whole of my childhood. When I escaped, I just flung myself into my future. Yeah, I wanted to go and do all of these things that I'd never had a chance to do, whether that was traveling on my own terms and going to museums or discovering music. There was very little music on the boat. So that's how I got involved in the opera house, or educating myself. I went and I not only got an undergraduate degree, but I got a PhD because I was so concerned to, make sure that I'd educated myself. And I think that mindset of just, rushing at the world and trying to do things has never really left me. And what I've discovered is it's incredible how many things you can do. If you really go for it and you're passionate about something, you can do some extraordinary things. So, the Heywood Foundation, which is something that I set up in memory of my sadly kind of late husband, Jeremy, passed away 5.5 years ago now, is dedicated to promoting innovation in public policy. So we work with the UK government to try and think of new, innovative public policy ideas. We sponsor senior civil servants to go and have a sabbatical to think about long-term policy ideas. I mean, this is a virtual foundation that kind of got created out of nothing using his memory because he was a very senior civil servant in the UK. And I think if people had been advising me, they would have said, Suzanne, don't try and do this alongside everything else that you do. But it's been a lot of fun, and I feel like we've actually created something really very interesting and kept a lot of things that Jeremy was passionate about alive. And on the Exor side, yes, it's quite a diverse portfolio of companies. It's a really interesting kind of overall company, kind of Exor. We're like we're very small in the kind of leadership group, but we have the kind of privilege of owning some quite incredible companies, and I get to get involved in some of those companies, which is great.
So you unite basically business, entrepreneurship, investing, policy making, which is quite interesting to also have this part covered with your family, and arts and music. And while you were speaking, I was thinking, I mean, this book starts in the 70s. It's really difficult for, I think, for young people to understand these days that it was not possible to consume music on an iPhone, on a smartphone. Taking your library of records was back then in the 70s. Compact discs were not invented yet. With you would have meant a lot of baggage to carry. And the funny thing was when I saw you first, your profile on LinkedIn, this Exo and holding company, this really resonated with me. And it was such a surprise to discover how colorful your life is, from sailing the world, from running through that. And one part before we dive into the book that I would like to cover, you're also involved in the startup community. Francesco posted your speech there. What I would like to hear, what excites you about the startup world?
Well, so there's a part of Exor called Exor Ventures. And Exor Ventures invests in early stage companies. And I should say the other way in which we get involved in early stage companies is through our bigger companies. So some of our bigger companies are Stellantis or Ferrari or Case New Holland, which makes agricultural equipment. All of those big companies also invest in startups because they know that a lot of really innovative things are happening in the startup community. What I love about startups is that they look at the world with very fresh eyes, and they tend to be incredibly customer focused because they will go and find a customer problem and then try to find a solution to it. They're not constrained by how a big company does things, so they can just go and solve that problem. And they will often therefore do something that's really very innovative. The challenge then can be with the kind of big companies is how do you absorb that innovation without killing it? And we've kind of found that's quite a kind of interesting challenge. So we do it in two different ways. One is we have Exor Ventures that just directly invests in early stage companies, and we have a kind of portfolio of those. And then secondly, we try to encourage our big companies to be aware of their own startup communities, so ag tech or whatever it is, and selectively to invest.
That's good to know. That's good to know. So it may be interesting for some people in the audience. And then you decided, besides all what you're doing professionally, you decided that it's time to write your memoir and capture your youth on the boat. What motivated you to share your youth with the world?
Well, I always knew that I was going to write Wave Walker, this book, because it's an incredible adventure that happened to me. And there is a part of me that's always been a writer. I used to write diaries and everything on the boat. Wave Walker is actually my fourth book. I wrote a business book. I wrote a memoir of my kind of late mother-in-law. I ended up writing a memoir of my husband, Jeremy Heywood, as well. So this is my fourth book, but this was always the book that I had to write. The only question for me was, when was I going to write it? Because I knew that if I wrote it, I would probably lose the remaining relationship that I had with my parents. I mean, either that or I would write a book that was so kind of false that it wasn't really worth writing. So although people will find when they read the book, it's not particularly aggressive or against my kind of parents, and I don't, I actually kind of want the reader to discover what I discovered as I went through. My parents don't tolerate any sort of criticism, so I knew that that was the risk. But finally, I got to the point in my life where my children, I have three children, were a similar age to where I was on Wave Walker, really struggling to get an education, to have friendships and all the rest of that. And I decided the more interesting thing, the more important thing for me now is to write this story. And so I did.
You mentioned that you wrote four books, and this is your fourth book, if I listened correctly. How was writing your memoir different from writing the other books, or was it just simply the same process?
No, it was actually quite different. So first of all, I'm very glad that it's my fourth book, because writing, like every other skill in life, takes a lot of practice.
That's true.
And I've definitely become a much better writer as I've written more books. And in fact, what happened with Wave Walker is I started writing it back in 2016, and then sadly, Jeremy became ill. I put Wave Walker to one side because I wanted to write his biography. And so that took me about a year working with him, and then about a year and a half after he died. And then I came back to Wave Walker. And I'd actually become a better writer by doing that as well. So when I came back to Wave Walker, I rewrote it. So what's similar across the books is I think I've become gradually a better writer. I've learned how to use language to express myself in a clearer and clearer way. And there's a difference between writing, my first book was a business book. There's a difference between writing clearly for business and writing something that is more literary. You know, that's a different style of writing. So that's similar. What's different is that Wave Walker is quite an emotional book, because this is a story of a little girl of 7 years old who was trapped on a boat for 10 years and had to figure out how to escape. And some of the things that happened in Wave Walker, although I knew that they'd happened and I knew I'd written about them in my diaries, I put them all at the back of my head. I didn't really want to go and confront what had happened on the boat. And so when I came to write it, I had to go back and rediscover all of that. I went and read my diaries. I went and met people who we'd met on the boat. I, kind of interviewed them. Many of the crew had diaries that they let me have. But most fundamentally, I had to confront what had happened in order to be able to write about it. So for me, it was a very emotional experience to write the memoir. And it was only by allowing it to be like that that it ended up being what it is, because otherwise it would have been a very superficial book.
Yeah, I think it's a great book to read. Especially the scenes. I mean, you wrote that you had this teddy with you, and it really evokes these pictures and emotions. So this little girl scared on a boat, in some moments with the teddy and looking for daddy. On the other hand, the happy days on islands, which you described with parrots, where there are monkeys. There was a funny part with monkeys, and I think it's also for non-native speakers possible to feel the emotions that you have put into that book. My next question is, how do we approach such a project? You have experience now with four books. How do we approach a project of writing a book that you make sure that you walk through all steps until you have a finished product and don't just drop it in the middle of that? Did you develop a method for writing a book that you could share?
Well, first of all, I should say, now that I've spoken to many other authors, I realize that there's no one way to write a book. So there are many different ways to write a book. So, and the other thing I've realized is that my way of doing it is not a very efficient way of doing it. It's very labor intensive. But the way in which I've done it, certainly with the book about my husband, Wave Walker, is I started off by creating the timeline of everything that had happened. Because even though this was something that I lived through, you don't remember exactly what happens through 10 years of your life. And so I had to put that all back together. And I did that by reading my diaries. Our passports were really helpful. I had my father's logbooks. I interviewed people, and I gradually put together this very kind of detailed timeline. And then the story started to emerge from that. And what I realized as the story started to kind of come out was a lot of the things that I created were unnecessary. You know, people didn't need to know about every island that we went to, even if interesting things happened. You know, even if, you know, I remember we went somewhere where we saw a dugong, which is an amazing animal in the harbor, and I'd written all about the dugong. And then I came back and I looked at it and I thought, it's interesting, but it's not really part of the story. It's not the story I'm trying to tell here. I'm trying to tell the story of what it was like to be a child on that boat and to escape from that boat. And so what I then found is I then threw away a lot of the work that I'd done so that we come back to the story, which is the essence of it. Because what people love is the, you know, the story of the people involved. And then there's a wonderful phase at the end of writing a book, towards the end, where you're really just working on the words and how the words flow and how you describe things. I love that part because that's the part where you can, it becomes a little bit more art. You know, how do you say something in as beautiful a way as you can possibly say it? So I think that that's the method that I've used for those. I think as I've got better at writing, I've got a little bit more efficient. I think I've learned that if you can earlier on work out what the story is, you can avoid a lot of the extra work that I've done in the kind of past, exploring things that don't end up being kind of part of the story. In a funny sort of way, it's very similar to business. You know, if in a business you are clear, well, the earlier that you can be clear in a business, what it is you're trying to achieve, what product you're trying to deliver, what you're trying to solve, you're going to stop worrying about all the other bits and pieces. But the thing with Wave Walker is I didn't really understand the story until I actually got a long way into writing it. And actually, I think when you read the book, you can see the depth that's there because it's, for example, at the start of every chapter, I've actually said how many days this particular chapter covers. And that's because originally I had all of that original detail. You don't need to know that, but it is quite interesting to know that we're now on kind of day 750 of being on this boat.
Yeah, yeah, I like that part, and it also helps me to then connect the story arc with the actual time spent on the boat, which I think is a key information to understand what you felt there. I mean, sailing the world is a dream many people have, but I think dreams idealize. So it's nothing bad can happen there. And you described that you have a balance of beautiful things, and you have this story with your family. You dive into resilience, into family, how family gets together, the hard times, how it falls apart, your pursuit of education. Uh, what message do you want to convey to the reader? What do you hope that readers will take away from the story when they read it?
So there's two big messages. You know, one message, and I'm trying to do something about both of these messages, actually. So the first message is the power of education. I mean, education is completely transforming, or can be completely transforming. The fact that I was able to educate myself, and then the fact that a university made a bet and let me in, transformed my life from being a little girl on a boat in boatyards into everything that I do today. Yeah, education is incredible. I don't know of any other tool that can do that in such a fundamental way, can change your life. And so what I'm doing on that topic is I am working with charities that are trying to get education to be available to more children. So, for example, a charity I've been working with has been trying to educate girls evacuated from Afghanistan. And you can change the course of their life if you can, their lives, if you can give them access to education. So that's the first thing, the power of education. And by the way, it doesn't just apply when you're a child, it can apply at any point in your life. I mean, education is an incredible thing. And one thing I'm very happy about is that I think education is becoming much more accessible than it used to be. Because now we have kind of online, we have AI, we have it's more accessible, more fun, more easier to do. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is there is something in the story about the rights of parents and the rights of children. So my parents believed that it was entirely their right to decide to sail around the world for 10 years, even if by doing so, their children couldn't go to school, couldn't have friends. I think I only saw a doctor once in 10 years. I only remember seeing a dentist once in kind of 10 years. I almost died several times, and so on and so on. But that was completely their right. They owned us as children. Now, I believe actually that there is a balance between kind of parents' rights and children's rights. And so one of the things which I'm very keen to explore, and I'm starting to do now, is how do we try to make sure that parents who take their children out of the system, whether that's by putting them on a boat or homeschooling them or whatever they might do, how do we at least make sure that we know where those children are? Because in the cases where it's not working, and sometimes it doesn't work, we need to find a way to help those children kind of reach out and get help. Because unfortunately, not all parents will balance the needs of children and the needs of parents in the appropriate way.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. 70s, different time. And I have to remind me that basically you didn't get any formal education for over 10 years before you joined Oxford. You made it into Oxford University, which is quite remarkable because your book starts with school, if I remember the first chapter right. And then your dad came home one day and disclosed to his family and say, okay, we travel the world, which was supposed to be a 2 year journey. How do you remember your initial reactions back in the days when your dad were talking to you?
Well, my initial reaction was, I guess, kind of excitement. I mean, I was a little girl of 7. I hero worshipped my father. I thought my father could do anything. He announced that we were going to go on this incredible adventure. We were going to sail around the world for 3 years. We were going to leave when I was 7. We'd be back when I was 10. We were going to follow Captain Cook around the world. My maiden name is kind of Cook. I was going to see some incredible places. We're all going to be together as a family. And by the time I was 10, we were going to be back. I would see my friends again, my beloved dog, Rusty, my doll's house, everything else, and it would all go back to normal. So I was sad because I was leaving my dog behind and my doll's house and my friends and my school, but I was also excited about going on this adventure.
So, I mean, back to education. So you started in school, you left everything behind, and there was no possibility, there was no internet. The books were incredibly difficult also to carry. When I look at the books behind me, it's not so easy like today. You have your Kindle with you. So it's really confined your space in a small ship, in a small boat, where you basically were with your brother, your mother, your father, and some guests. How was the dynamic on board between the family and the guests?
Well, first of all, you're right. I mean, the problem at the time was it was very hard to get an education. My mother took some worksheets with us, maths and English, and occasionally would do them, but it was very sporadic. And I briefly went to school in Australia, and then eventually I tried to teach myself by post. However, we shouldn't be assured that it doesn't happen today, because I'm now being contacted by lots of people who are younger than me who've had similar experiences where they've been taken out of the system, and even
Oh,
though
really?
education is more accessible, they're still struggling to get an education because if you're on a boat, sailing, even if you've got the internet, it can be incredibly difficult to get an education. But the dynamic on the boat changes over the years, and that's what's interesting about the story, because over a 10-year period, everything changes. I mean, most fundamentally, I'm getting older. I start as a little girl of 7. I end up as a girl of 17, a kind of young woman. and all the things that happen in between. Same with my brother, turning into a young man. My mother becomes increasingly tired of being on the boat. She gets incredibly seasick, and she loves parties. So she's also trapped on this boat in a funny sort of way. And I think my father ends up getting trapped, though he would never admit it, because we have very little money. We weren't a wealthy family, and a boat is very expensive. So he becomes trapped in the need to keep on taking crew on board to pay for this voyage, but never really making that much money. You know, I'm forced to kind of cook and clean for the crew on board. It was a very gendered world where I was expected as the girl to kind of cook and clean. But he's kind of trapped as well. And what happens to the family dynamics is they start off fine. You know, we're kind of little kids on the boat, apart from the fact that we're very bored and it's quite dangerous. And then particularly as I get older, I come much more in conflict with my mother, and the dynamic there becomes very difficult. My father becomes less and less tolerant, less willing to make any sort of kind of compromises as we go along. And eventually, you know, my brother and I are effectively kind of abandoned in New Zealand.
Oh, oh, how was that?
Well, that last bit of the book where by this point I'm 16 and my brother is 15, and my parents become increasingly worried about my brother's education. As a girl, they were much less worried about my education. They wanted me to cook and clean on the boat, but they were not that worried about my education. They became very worried about his education. And so he was enrolled in a school in New Zealand, and I was left looking after him, and they sailed off and didn't come back. They came back for a couple of very brief 1 to 2 day visits, but they basically didn't come back for 9 months. And that was the most difficult period because I'm a 16-year-old. I know no adults in New Zealand. My visa keeps on running out. They've left us in a very isolated place, very beautiful again, really beautiful place, but really isolated. And I describe in the book actually how I become incredibly depressed. I end up ringing up Youthline, which is like a kind of one of those phone lines that you ring when you're in desperate trouble. But one way or another, I get myself through that year. And that's the year when I write to every university I've ever heard of in the world, asking them if they will consider letting me come and study.
How did you survive there? I mean, no money, no, your brother and yourself. What
Well,
was the plan?
my father left a very small amount of money in a bank account, not his main money. He put a small amount of money in another account, which I could access by forging his signature because I was too young to have a bank account. But we didn't have very much money at all. We had a very old car which kept on breaking down. I think looking back, the biggest risk was that I became incredibly depressed and I had nobody. I didn't know anybody, no adults at all. And it's an extraordinary position to leave a young girl and a young boy in, and then just to abandon them and sail away. Because of course I couldn't ring my parents when there were problems. But one way or another, I did get through it. I describe it in the book, and it gets very dark. And then we get to the kind of the darkest bit, and then eventually it starts to kind of turn around, and I come back out of it. And that's the start of me actually escaping, because when I write these letters off to every university in the world, most of them write back and say that they won't consider me. But one, Oxford, amazingly writes back and says that they will. If I can get myself to Oxford, they'll give me an interview. And so I went and picked kiwi fruit, which is, you know, national product of New Zealand, earned enough money for a one-way ticket back to the UK, and did the interview. And incredibly, they let me in. And that changed my life, completely changed my life.
I mean, I grew up at the countryside in Austria, mountains, small town, 12,000 inhabitants. And I mean, education, we had formal education, but also a lot of, I would say, troubled families and children growing up in difficult circumstances. It was 70s, 80s, a lot of unemployment in the region where I grew up. And many of those kids simply gave up. So started with drugs, started drinking, and practically threw their life away. You describe in your book and also in the conversation that you had a yearning for education and that you really wanted to do something in this world and not give up. then you managed to get into Oxford from New Zealand. Just remember, internet was not invented back then. What sparked this interest? Where did you get your strength from? Why didn't you give up like other people would do in similar situations?
It's very hard. It's very hard to know that. And actually, I think it could easily have gone a different way. But there is something inside me which is very strong. I have gone back now, and I've been looking at the academic literature on what happens to children who, as you described, come from very difficult childhoods. There's some very good, they're called longitudinal studies, where they look at children growing up over a very long period of time and see what happens to them. What those studies seem to show is that most people who come from a very difficult childhood are impacted by it one way or another. They end up not having normal relationships or not having normal kind of careers. Although many of them do manage to fix that, by kind of midlife or a little bit later, but they are seriously impacted. But interestingly, about a quarter of them manage to get themselves out of there and actually do go on and have fairly normal lives in terms of kind of academia and jobs and relationships. And some of them thrive. I mean, we all know some incredible entrepreneurs who come from incredibly difficult childhoods. Elon Musk, for example, just to name an obvious one, but I could kind of list off 15 or 20. And in fact, if you do the reverse exercise of looking at a group of very successful entrepreneurs or politicians, you will find a large number of them have come from very challenged childhoods. So I think if you manage to escape from these childhoods, you do walk away with something. There is a benefit of that childhood. So I wouldn't wish it on anybody, and it's not worth the cost, let's put it that way. But there is a real benefit. And there's a kind of overused word, which is kind of resilience. And there is something about that. It's an ability to keep going when things are against you. And also, I think there's a lack of willingness to accept other people's rules. A lot of entrepreneurs are very, very good at some, saying, I see a problem, I'm going to go and fix that problem. And despite the fact that everybody's telling me that, nobody's been able to fix it before, so why do you think you're going to be able to fix it? Or, kind of don't bother doing that because there's some big company in that space and they'll kind of eat you up. An entrepreneur has the guts, or if you like, the kind of waywardness to just go and do it anyway. And they are very resilient when it doesn't work. They'll pick themselves up and try again. And, that one didn't work, so I'll try again. A lot of them come from very difficult childhoods. So I don't know what differentiates that group from the ones who don't, but it does seem to be a thing that, some people, if they manage to escape, they go on, and there are some kind of benefits that come out of that sort of very challenged childhood.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you mentioned. When I look at the internet and that on and offline conversations, people very often point out that they say, look, all successful people come from wealth. They come from money. They have rich parents. Probably they got their first 10 million in the bank account before they were born. They can start their first company with money. It's easy to get customers because daddy refers the customers to them. And when you look at the reality of entrepreneurs, most of the most successful people in the world didn't have rich parents that basically sugarcoated their whole life.
No, it's really true. And what's great about that is that means that anyone can become an entrepreneur. Anybody can do something. And I have said to a few people who've kind of come up to me and they've said, look, my life has been very difficult. I didn't get a proper education. Maybe they've had to kind of leave a country because of a war or other situation. What I've actually said to them is, now that you've escaped, you actually have a little bit of a secret weapon, because you have a strength that people who haven't had to do that will never have. You have both an ability to do things that other people say you shouldn't do because you're much less constrained, and you have a resilience because you know what difficult is. And those things can enable you to be very successful. Whereas somebody who's had a much more straightforward time of it, which, by the way, as I say, is a much better way to go. And there are many benefits of that. First of all, it's a lot more enjoyable. But But what they don't necessarily have is the ability to pick themselves up when things go wrong, because they're used to everything going right. And being an entrepreneur is a very tough job, as many of your
That's true.
listeners will know. You know, things go wrong all the time because you're trying to start something new that's never been done before. And therefore, many of the different ways in which you try to do it will probably fail. And you've got to be willing to try it multiple times until you find the way that works.
Yeah, that's true. You mentioned Elon Musk before, and Walter Isaacson in his biography describes it very well in the first chapters that his parents were not rich. I think when he came with his mother to Canada and his brothers and sisters, there were nothing. There were one room. They slept in one room with a few $1,000s. I also read today that Exeter is referred to as the Berkshire Hathaway of Europe. So maybe you're also the European role model and similar to Elon Musk, that it's possible to get out of
I
misery.
don't think I can compare myself to Elon Musk. But yes, there is something about that mindset of that sort of background, which is, and I think it's, what is great is it's hugely motivating for those people who didn't kind of grow up with $10 million in the bank and father helping them out.
When we go back to New Zealand, to your journey, I mean, today it would be easy. You just use the internet, you search for universities in the world. New Zealand was in the 80s. It was second half of 80s when I did the maths right. How did you find out about the University of Oxford, and how did you manage to get in from basically New Zealand being left alone, no formal education? How did you manage that?
Well, in a way, this is another good example of, had I talked to anybody, I didn't really have anyone to talk to, but had I talked to anybody, they would have said, Suzanne, in order to, apply to these universities, you've got to go through a process, you're going to need to get advice, you've got to write the letter in a certain sort of way. And anyway, what makes you think that you can apply to these universities when you've not really been to a proper school?
It's impossible.
It's impossible. But the great thing about my childhood is, first of all, that I didn't have anyone to tell me not to do it, but also, and it taught me a lesson all the way through my life when people have told me not to do something. Sometimes they're right, so it's not that I ignore them, but quite often I'll go and do it anyway. And amazingly, quite often you can do it. So what I did in New Zealand was I thought, well, what am I going to do? I don't even know how to find the addresses of these universities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a letter about who I am. I'm a girl who's grown up on a boat for 10 years. I've grown up watching the whales and dolphins off the side of the boat. I have got some qualifications through this correspondence school. I really want to go and study biology at university. Will you consider me? So a slightly crazy letter. And then I wrote it off to every university I'd ever heard of. And of course, the universities I'd heard of were the elite universities, because even sitting on a boat in the South Pacific, you've heard of Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard. So I basically wrote to, Oxford University, Oxford, England, Auckland University, Auckland, New Zealand, Sydney University, Sydney, Australia, Harvard University, Harvard, America. And then what happened is lots of them wrote back and said no. So Sydney said no because you're not Australian. Auckland said no because you're not New Zealand. London University said no because your qualifications are too strange. Harvard never wrote back. I now realize that Harvard University, Harvard America is not the correct address, which is very unfortunate. But Oxford wrote back. And I think one or two others did, but Oxford most kind of notably. Oxford wrote back and said, okay, it's a bit of a strange letter. Write us a couple of essays and we'll think about it. And then, of course, it's amazing also what you can do if you just apply, common sense to something. So I thought, well, what am I going to do writing 2 essays? If I write an essay that everybody would expect me to write, I'll be compared to people who are going to a normal school, who have teachers, who have libraries, and it will look terrible. So I can't write an essay, for example, about the discovery of DNA or or evolution. I can't write a standard essay. So I wrote one essay about doing science at sea, and so what the challenges were of trying to become a scientist or a young scientist living on a boat. Things like when I had to do my dissection, you had to dissect something. I had to go and catch my own frog on an island. and then I dissected it on my mother's chopping board. So, you know, it was quite a kind of funny essay, but it just kind of showed what my life had been like and how you tried to solve all of these challenges of learning science when not going to school. And then the other one was a very odd topic, which was whether or not humans are a domesticated animal, which is just a very weird topic. And the only reason why I picked it was because I thought nobody else will write an essay about this, and therefore they can't compare me to somebody who's gone to school. And based on those two essays, they invited me for this interview. I think they just thought she's so weird, we have to kind of invite her and see what she says.
What was the conclusion in the second essay that humans are
Yeah,
domestic
no, they
animals?
absolutely are. So if you look at all of the traits, so if you look at, for example, the domestication of dogs, which used to be wolves, or the domestication of cats that came from, there's lots of traits that come with being domesticated. And you can then look at how humans behave, and many of the same characteristics apply. It's a bit of a kind of weird topic. I mean, I was very lucky actually. That topic was suggested to me. I had a teacher at the correspondence school who I'd never met. We just corresponded by letters, and he suggested that topic. And it was what was nice about it is it enabled me just to think. And as I say, I knew nobody else was going to write about this subject. So, and then when I turned up at Oxford, they, you know, and I had my interview with the tutor there, she just wanted to talk about the books that I'd read. So that was fine. You know, I could talk about the books that I'd read and what I thought and all these things. And, you know, in a way, for her, she already knew that my education was very strange. So luckily, she didn't ask me about all the normal things that you should have learned at school, like my times tables or how to spell anything, because then I would have failed. You know, she just wanted to know if I was intellectually curious. And then she let me in.
Yeah, it's good to know that Oxford looks after people they let into the university and also opens doors for unusual careers, unusual people with unusual experiences. What sparked your interest for science on the boat? I mean, as you mentioned before, your environment were anything but that. And you then moved towards a scientific education. What sparked this interest in your youth?
Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it? I think I've always been really curious about how things work. So how does the world work? And I remember when I was a young teenager, and at that point we were in Hawaii. We'd sailed all the way to South America and South Africa. We got shipwrecked crossing the Indian Ocean. We got to Australia. We went all the way up to Hawaii. So we're 4 years into our voyage. And we stayed in Hawaii for a little bit. I wanted to go home at this point, but my parents were determined to keep sailing. But while we were in Hawaii for that brief period, I watched a whole series of programs by somebody called Carl Sagan, who was very well known at that point in time. It's the kind of early 80s. And he would do programs about what the stars were made of and how many stars were in the sky and the Library of Alexandria. And these programs I found incredibly inspiring. It's amazing how these things can kind of kick off an idea in a child's mind. And so actually I trace it back to that. That kind of started me off on this idea that maybe I could try and work out how the world worked. The problem, I think, is of all the subjects to try and follow if you can't go to school, science is probably the hardest, because English or the arts, you can, to some extent, teach yourself, you know, at least you've got books you can read and poetry you can write. But science, you need to be in a laboratory, you need to learn facts. So it became very difficult trying to teach myself science, but I was very determined to do it as best I could. And in the end, I did it well enough that I could pursue it. And that kind of curiosity has remained with me. And one of the strengths of my very odd education is that I did, because I was on the boat and because I was following this Australian schooling system, I actually studied multiple different subjects because I was trying to I basically tried to teach myself anything I could find. So I ended up with this very eclectic education, not a proper education, but very eclectic. And that has actually served me quite well. in later life, because I have an interest in art, I have an interest in music, you know, I was fascinated by geography. So even though science was my thing, because I couldn't do as much science as I wanted, I was kind of forced to go and find out about other things as well. And that curiosity, which I would recommend to everyone, has always stood me in great kind of stead, because you find out about things, and that's really helpful. Now I find working with the various different companies I work with, there's lots of bits of knowledge that somehow that's there and it becomes useful.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Even in the ages of AI, it still helps being curious and trying to figure out the world on your own and with your own means. The book Wave Walker describes a lot of challenges. I think the readers can get the book and read about it by themselves. My next question is about the challenges and the lessons you learned with the challenges. What are the top 3 lessons that you learned on the boat, and how have this experience helped you professionally?
So I think the first one, which I referred to before, is this point around resilience, which I know it's a word that some people kind of struggle with, and I should explain what I mean by it. What I mean is, so what I don't mean is that by being resilient, you're somehow impervious to, you're not affected by things that happen to you that are bad. I mean, we're all affected by things that happen to us which are bad. But what I have found coming from that background is that when something happens which is bad, I can put it in proportion, because I know what really bad looks like. Really bad is being a little girl, 7 years old, on a boat in the middle of the Indian Ocean when we were shipwrecked. So when I face a problem, and it sounds a little bit silly, but literally my brain works like this. But when I face a problem, so for example, one of our companies is struggling and I need to go and help them, and people are getting very upset, I can put it in proportion, because nobody's life is in danger. We will get this sorted out. There will be not necessarily a good course, but there will be a least bad course that we can take, which is going to be the best one, under the circumstances. And that ability to put things in proportion enables me to stay very calm when things are difficult. And I think if, as a leader, you can stay very calm when things are difficult, you're much more able to be rational. You're much more able to listen to what people say, because normally there'll be somebody, around who has a very good idea, even if you don't have one yourself. So that is a huge strength, that kind of calmness, that ability to put things into proportion, which is what I kind of call resilience. So that's one thing. I think the second thing for me is, because I came from outside of normal society, there's lots of disadvantages of that, but one upside of it is I'm not as constrained by it as other people. So I remember multiple points in my life where people have said, Suzanne, you can't do that for whatever reason. Because sometimes it's not the socially accepted thing to do, or it's not what you're expected to do at that point in time. Or, to give you a couple of examples, I remember when I first joined, I went to McKinsey. After I did my degree and my PhD, I went to the UK government for a few years. Then I went to McKinsey, and then I came here to Excel. And when I was at McKinsey, I remember when I first joined, going off and wandering around and meeting some of the partners who worked in sectors that I thought were interesting. And then I remember going back, and my colleagues said, you can't do that. You can't kind of go wandering around and chatting to people. It's just not what you do. And it's not that there was any rule against it. And I kind of knew it was unusual to do it. And I was doing it in quite a kind of gentle way. But I don't feel as constrained by what you're expected to do or what you're not expected to do, as some people will. So that, I think, is a kind of huge strength, and that served me quite well. I think then the kind of third thing is, I have discovered that if you really want to do something, if you are determined enough and you keep going at it, you can achieve things that people don't think you can achieve. So I guess an example of this is writing the book. So a lot of people said to me, okay, well, Suzanne, I know you want to write this book, Wave Walker, But how on earth are you going to do it? Because you've got all these other things you're doing. You don't have time to write a book. And anyway, it's not really to do with your work life. How on earth are you going to find the time? And is it a good way for you to spend your time? What I discovered is if you really want to do something and you're quite determined, just keeping going at it on a on a kind of regular basis, you can get a huge amount done. So with the book, what I did was I was often spending 15, 20 minutes in a day, the end of the day, or when I was commuting home on the underground train, or, when I was, sitting in a taxi going somewhere, or just after I put the kids to bed, or whatever it was, I would set myself the ambition of every day at some point, I will spend minimum 15 minutes, sometimes a bit longer if it's on the weekend, and I will just keep on doing it. I'm not going to wait for the perfect day. I remember at one point I was even, and this sounds completely ridiculous, I worked out how to put the book on my mobile phone, and I started this is probably not to be recommended, I started kind of editing it as I used to walk up to my house from the train station on the phone. Probably not a very good idea, because I'm sure it's health and safety, not a good idea. But I didn't have any other time to do it. And what I discovered is, and the same applies with work things as well, if you really want to get something done, you can find the time to do it. So those for me, I think, would be kind of three big kind of strengths. One is this resilience. The other is this kind of just not, I'm now much more conscious of what I'm supposed to do and what I'm not supposed to do, but I don't feel as constrained by it, I think, as many people do, because I didn't grow up in that. And then this third thing, which is, just go and do it, whatever it is. If you've got a kind of ambition that you're going to start a company, don't kind of wait until you've managed to tidy everything up in your life and you've got time and you've got money and everything sorted out. If you really want to go and start a company, go and get going. Even if you're only spending an hour on it a day, kind of figuring out the business plan or interviewing customer, you just kind of go and do it. And it will build. It will build quite kind of gradually, but you can build a mountain a few rocks at a time.
This is not a Nike commercial, so just do it. That's
Yeah,
basically the message
just
behind
do
it.
it. Just do it, but you can do it kind of in little tiny bits, is my point. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be. Lots of people wait for the perfect moment, but the perfect moment never comes.
Now this is I can relate to that. So this is when when some people want to start something, say, okay, in 1 week I will have 8 hours and I can work 8 hours, full 8 hours on this project, and I can start in the morning at 8 o'clock and I can work then until whatever, 6 o'clock in the evening, 10 o'clock in the evening, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then suddenly something happens, the day never comes, they postpone it next week and next week. And you said you wrote your book in 15 minutes bursts. So basically 5 minutes on the train, 5 minutes walking home with the headphone from the train station, in the taxi, in the subway. And this is the end result then. So basically this is the outcome of being just committed and doing it in baby steps. That's the right understanding.
That's right. That's right. And I think that applies to other things as well. It applies to kind of book writing, but it applies to many other things in life, whatever it is that somebody wants to do, both kind of work things, but also other things. I've got friends who wanted to learn to play the piano. That's always something. You can do it, but, do it in little bits, don't be daunted by it.
Do it in 5 minutes, but start with 5 minutes, then increase next week to 10 minutes to 50 minutes. I mean, this is a process. This is when someone understands it and has a role model, like entrepreneurs, for example, when you probably you also coach startups that you invest in, you can tell them and they can learn and they can apply the process. The second part that you mentioned is resilience. And sometimes I have people in my life who say, okay, I had really a good life, rich family, rich people, rich parents. There was no problem whatsoever. Daddy, mommy solved everything. How can people acquire resilience? I mean, what's your advice? Do they need to get on a boat for 10 years and come back and then say, okay, I'm resilient, or become a US citizen, join the Navy SEALs or the Army Rangers? And then when they come back after 10 years in some wars, then they're resilient. How can people acquire that in normal life to become more resilient? What's your advice to them?
Well, my advice is that, most people actually and unfortunately will either, and this of course is more likely as you're going to go on in life, will either encounter something bad, or they will know somebody who's encountered something that's kind of truly bad. By which I often mean, so, you may yourself have been made redundant or had something bad happen to you at work. You may have lost a parent or a sibling, or you may know somebody but which something actually really objectively bad has happened. And then for me, it's the kind of consciousness of when something which is much more day to day happens that's bad, whether it's losing one customer at work, or having a difficult conversation with a colleague, or somebody denting your car, things which are really quite annoying but are not significant in the course of a life. It's teaching yourself to pause and put it in perspective. Now, it's much easier to do that if you've actually been the one who's gone through that very adverse event, but it doesn't, you can still do it. I mean, because as I say, most of us, as we go on in life, we will sadly either directly or will know somebody for which something really bad has happened. And when you start to kind of spiral and say, okay, because my car has been dented, that's a disaster, that's all I can kind of deal with, it's a big problem, or because I've had a setback at work, or the idea that I originally thought about isn't going to work, put it in proportion. Are you still okay? Are you still going to go back tonight and you've still got, I mean, it sounds a bit basic, but yeah, if you still got food on the table, your kids are still okay, everything's okay, you've just got a problem to deal with. Okay, and that's kind of part of life. That's part of the fun of life, is that we've got to overcome things and create, kind of overcome obstacles and find solutions to things. So I think anybody can do that. I think it's made easier if you've got the personal comparison in your head, but I think it's open to anybody to kind of have that mindset of pausing when something goes wrong and forcing yourself to put it into perspective.
Yeah, that's good advice. I think actively looking for hardship can help create resilience. It was Bruce Lee who said, just looked up the quote, "Do not pray for an easy life, pray for the strength to endure a difficult one." And I think this is just look for hardship, get on the hard project, work yourself through it, don't throw it away, and do it. The other side is that sometimes it's better to give up. So it's not every challenge should be consumed until
No.
the end point. How do you weigh that? How did you find for yourself the balance? I mean, you left the boat, you left this hardship, you went to university, you went to Oxford and said, no, this is not the way that I want to live. I want a different way. How do you make this decision to say, okay, is it worth pursuing that hard way, or is it better to give up this way and choose another one? What's your criteria for making this decision?
So I think it's, and this is another thing which is quite hard for us to do, but you can kind of do it with practice. It's quite important when you're in a situation to try to think about it over different time frames. So when I did my PhD I actually went to Cambridge and did my PhD. I didn't really enjoy some of my PhD, and I began increasingly to realize that probably I didn't want to become an academic. But it's then very important to kind of force yourself to stop and try to work out, well, why do I feel like that? Is it that I'm not enjoying this immediate thing that I'm doing, but actually the idea of being an academic and everything that comes with it is fine? Or is this a much more fundamental thing, which is this lifestyle is just not the lifestyle that I want? And you've got to kind of think about it, because sometimes short-term obstacles are worth overcoming if long-term that's what you want to do. But there's no point in overcoming short-term obstacles if you're continuing down a route which really isn't kind of working. And for me, in that case, I realized that I wanted a lifestyle or a way of working which was much more working with other people. For me, the academic lifestyle was just too narrow and too isolated. I wanted to go and work in teams with other people and get kind of energy from that and kind of give energy from that. So I just realized it wasn't the right fit for me. And therefore I switched and I went into kind of government. So I think you need to ask yourself, when you hit an obstacle, is this an obstacle that it's worth overcoming? Or is this an obstacle that I'm just overcoming because it happens to be there? Lots of people, when you ask them why they climb a mountain, they say because it's there. That's fine. But mountains at work, you shouldn't just climb because they're there. You've got to climb them because you think it's a mountain worth climbing. So it's always worth pausing when you get into an obstacle to work out whether you're just climbing that obstacle because it happens to be the thing that's in front of you, or whether you're climbing it because it really is worth getting over and there is no better way to do it. And of course we see this all the time at work. You'll get partway into an IT project and discover that it's much more complicated for whatever reason than you thought it might be. It's always worth having that pause. There's a little example that people use, kind of come up off the dance floor and go up onto the balcony and just stop and think about it for a moment. Am I pursuing this because it really is worth it, but it's tough? Or am I pursuing it because it was the thing that I thought that I should be doing, or I was told that I should be doing? And actually, there might be a much better way of achieving it, or I might actually decide that the goal that I'm going for is not the right one. So I agree. People shouldn't confuse determination with just keeping going at all costs because you started doing something.
This is extremely important in investing. I learned with the German company Wirecard. It's tempting to throw money
Yeah.
into a company when the market sentiment is so positive that it just seems illogical not to do it at this given point in time. And even if the balance sheet looks good, this what you've described this picture with with the dance floor. Sometimes it's good to get off the dance floor and up into the balcony and look at the thing and say, okay, when there is smoke, there might be fire, and don't ignore the smoke. Just cut yourself a little bit short and don't throw money after bad things. But on the other hand, Nvidia, for example, is another great example that very often looked like an extremely dangerous investment, or like an investment cyclical business. I mean, chips 10 years ago, nobody wanted to invest it. I think this picture, I like it as get off the dance floor and just think about it for a while.
Yeah, and those two examples are very kind of interesting examples, aren't they? I mean, I think there was a period of time with NVIDIA where they were making some quite big bets, and it was, I mean, it was a lot cheaper then, so you would have done very well if you'd gone in, but it was much riskier. And to go in very, very heavily when it was very highly risk, because it wasn't at all clear that the bets that they were making around the technologies were going to kind of pay off. And that is very different to kind of where they are now. People can argue about whether or not the kind of valuation is fair for where they are, but they have made some bets which have kind of played out. But yes, I think it really does apply when you're an investor. Anything that you've invested in the past is kind of gone. It's either worked or it hasn't worked. But the fact that you've done it. The only exception to that, I think, is when you're in a situation where you've got a certain amount of invested and you think the company is turnaroundable and it's worth helping it to kind of do that. But by and large, I think as an investor, you have to be quite clear-headed about something. And just because it might have looked like a good idea 6 months ago, you probably know more now. And if what you know now is different to what you knew 6 months, sometimes we all have to take a blow to our pride and admit that we were wrong.
Yeah.
And walk away.
Wirecard, I had fun with Wirecard. Nvidia was a story, unbelievable story, 2013. So nobody recommended investing in chips. Who needs that anyways? And I think every shareholder will agree Nvidia deserves this market cap that they have now. If it will stay, I don't know. But the thing is that the one point you said, one important word, conformity. And you have many board roles. And as a board member, I think the way I understand boards are that they should challenge the management and should point at the weak spots, which is not something nice to do sometimes. And it's not, some companies expect their board members to act as the founders want to. How do you deal with the feedback then? I mean, you said you learned on your boat not to, rather to push boundaries and to not do what others expect you to do. But how do you deal with feedback? I mean, I can imagine that very often it produces not only positive feedback, but also a lot of negative feedback. How do you know that it's worth to stay the course and just deal with the blows?
So we talk about, the ideal board member for us is a critical friend to the company. And I quite like this phrase, critical friend, because if you don't have those two elements, either one on its own is no good at all. Yeah, there's no point in being a board member if all you're going to do is criticize the company that you're trying to support. Because what happens if you do that, and I've seen kind of board members do that, is the company eventually becomes incredibly defensive and loses kind of motivation, will stop sharing things with the board. The dynamic between the board and the management kind of falls apart. Likewise, having board members who are just friends, who just kind of turn up and say, this is fantastic, what a great job, it's all kind of going well, that's not very helpful either. So we actually talk about being critical friends and actually being more critical when things are good and a little bit more friendly sometimes when things are bad, because the temptation is that when a company is struggling a little bit, everybody can then piles in and becomes even more critical. But that's actually not very helpful at all.
Mhm.
And likewise, when things are good, everybody kind of relaxes and says, well, this is all kind of great. But actually, it's when things are good that you can really do something amazing. It was very interesting listening. I listened to the last kind of NVIDIA kind of call, which you probably did as well, and they're talking about all the other things that they're now going to do as a company. Things are clearly very good for them, but they are thinking about doing all sorts of new things, which is interesting. So a company really needs to be challenged when things are good. So that's what I try to do as a board member. I try to be a kind of critical friend. So I'm not afraid to ask a difficult question, even if I'm the only person on the board to ask the difficult question. I'm very happy to do that. I'll very rarely be, in fact, I'm never aggressive or overtly kind of negative about the company. I will ask difficult questions. And when a company is really struggling, but through no fault of its own, I'll also be incredibly supportive, which I think is important as well. But that kind of boundary between being on the board and being in an executive role is a tricky one. And it is one that takes quite a lot of practice. And that's, even though I now work on boards that are very different in terms of what the companies do, I do everything from tractors to high-heeled shoes. That the ability to kind of be on a board and ask a good question that hopefully leads into a kind of really productive conversation about what a company should do, that's a skill that's pretty transferable across different companies.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think critical friend is a good description of what a board member should be. And there are many new board members. When I look at LinkedIn, many startups, many new venture funds. So they are the first timers, and I think they can benefit from your explanation. The one thing that came to my mind while you were speaking, being a critical friend. When startups close a funding round, suddenly they go from broke basically overnight to having 10, 50, 100 million on the bank account. And it's tempting then to buy the 5 Teslas and to buy 10 more pinball machines. How do you deal with that as a critical friend? What would you tell those founders when they have money on their bank account and you see that they're starting overexpanding, hiring 100 employees and overstaffing the company? What would your advice be?
Well, I think it's always very important to be clear about the difference between what costs that are variable costs and costs that are fixed costs. And so I remember as we kind of came out of COVID, sitting on the board of some of our companies, and a lot of the costs were coming up very dramatically post-COVID, as we knew, because we had supply chain challenges and people were recruiting and all sorts of things. And I was always very keen to try and get clear, which of these costs that we're putting in are variable costs, so they're actually changing as our sales are increasing. But if our sales go down, they're going to come down automatically. And which are the things that you're doing which are not easy to reverse? Kind of buying everybody a Tesla is not an easy thing to reverse if all of a sudden, the sun goes behind a cloud and it starts kind of raining. If you're investing in, building even better products for customers, that's a kind of long-term investment. But I'm very cautious about just putting kind of costs in that you've just got to carry over time. I mean, another way to think about it, I remember when my late husband, who used to work in the UK government, he at one point went and worked for Morgan Stanley. And so all of a sudden his income went up very considerably because he was in the public sector and he went into Morgan Stanley. I actually knew that there was a very high likelihood that he would go back into government because he was passionate about public service. And so what I did was I used some of that money that he earned for capital, for kind of things that we needed as a family. We actually had to kind of move into a slightly bigger house because we had 3 children and we were very crammed. So we moved into a slightly bigger house. What I didn't do was to spend that money on what I would call, and I'm an ex-Treasury official, what I would call running costs. So, for example, my husband, who liked his wine, kept on saying to me, "We are buying nicer wine now, aren't we?" And I kept on saying, "Yes, we are." And of course, I didn't buy any nicer wine because I knew if I kind of upgraded the wine, we would then be stuck with the better wine forever. Yeah. Whereas the kind of capital cost of moving house, that was just a one-off thing. It's slightly kind of, but you see what I mean? There's things that you can do which are one-off costs, which, and then there's things that you do which are going to be like a kind of permanent cost that you've just got to keep on paying over time. And eventually he did go back into the public sector. He took a 90% pay cut to go back into the public sector, but it was absolutely fine because our day-to-day costs hadn't much changed from when he'd been there before. So in a company, as I say, what I try to do is differentiate between things which are variable costs and things which are fixed costs. And then more on a kind of personal side, I'm very conscious of things which are, one-off costs, which if you've got a little bit of money and it's not going to change your kind of fundamental costs, then that's fine. And then, fundamentally kind of increasing your lifestyle cost in a way that locks you into a series of, locks you into a position. And I have seen a lot of people in life who, maybe it's a kind of founder who suddenly feels they have a lot of money and they massively increase the cost of their lifestyle. They decide that, okay, what they're going to do is they're going to buy 3 houses and they're going to have a boat. By the way, boats are very expensive. They're going to have a plane, whatever it is. And then all of a sudden the company gets into a more difficult situation and they're really stuck because they've got all of these running costs that they've got to keep on doing. And that I think is very dangerous. So I think being very thoughtful about the sort of spending that you do and never getting yourself trapped, either as a company or as an individual, is really important.
Yeah, that's true. Upgrading the lifestyle is painful when someone later has to downgrade it again. Entrepreneurship, it always has these swings. I think I never saw a story that was just straightforward upward. It is always up and down and up and down. And cost cutting, lifestyle hurts. Cutting back on the lifestyle really hurts. I think the best way would be to just stay Buddhist monk, living frugally, not being attached to anything worldly. So this is Elon Musk is a good example, I think, for that. When I look at the book, they very often describe that he sleeps in factories and in these PayPal years, and upgrading the lifestyle is not the best thing. Coming to the next question is, you faced a lot of adversity also in your life. And many young people also still today struggle in the West, in other parts of the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asian countries. No education, domestic violence, living in remote places like you did. What's your advice to them when they manage to listen to such an episode?
Well, my fundamental advice is to try and get an education. I mean, that is the most important thing. And I'm not going to minimize how hard it can be to do that, particularly if you're in a situation where you're expected to work from an early age, which I was on the boat, or you're very isolated, or you're in a family situation which is incredibly kind of dysfunctional. But one way or another, getting an education is the thing that can change your life. And one thing that makes me very hopeful about the world at the moment, despite all of the things that we know, all the terrible things which are happening, is that we have technology advancements that make education much easier to access. It's another reason why, it's one reason why I'm very excited about AI as well. I mean, AI is a huge enabler. I mean, if we could get to a world where no matter how poor you are, how isolated you are, you can get access to many of the best teachers that anyone could access, that would be incredible, absolutely incredible. And I think the technologies that we have should increasingly do that. So that would be my advice to them is, education is really worth it. It's incredibly hard. It's very easy to give up when it feels much harder. And then the second thing is that, as I kind of mentioned earlier, those adversities that you're overcoming are terrible and they are, not something anyone would wish for, but you will get a benefit from them. If you manage to get through them, it is going to teach you a bunch of things that people who've had a much easier time will never learn. So do kind of, obviously nobody would wish anybody to be in those situations, but, do bear in mind that, you will learn something from this. You will come out a stronger person if you can educate yourself.
Yeah, that's true. I think Viktor Frankl would agree to your statement that adversity is something that people have to endure and not give up and just push through that. Which brings me to the next question: female leadership, women in leadership in 2024. What changes are you most excited about? Did the world become a better place when we look at female leadership in the last 2 decades?
Yes, it absolutely has. I mean, when I started my career, it was still quite unusual to have women in senior positions. And you had a big expectation from society, which I certainly felt, that as a woman, and particularly when you become a mother, that you shouldn't kind of work, in the way that a man would if they became a father. And I think all of those expectations have now changed. And obviously mothers, like fathers, kind of, at least most normal ones, care immensely about their children. But this kind of expectation that somehow mothers and not fathers should be the ones that sacrifice their careers for their children, that's kind of gone away. And I think kind of couples now have much more open conversations about how they're going to make sure that their children are well looked after and loved and happy, whilst both sides of the kind of partnership get an opportunity to have a career and therefore kind of make their kind of families kind of financially strong. On the working side, companies have also changed immensely. I remember when I first had children and I was at McKinsey at the time, they had a rule that when you went off on maternity leave, they should take your computer away from you on the basis that that was going to be a cost saving. And that was one of the rules I had to fight to get that rule overturned, because the point is that if they take away your computer and you're away on maternity leave for 6 months, you're going to lose all of your clients. You've got no access to any of the knowledge. Your chance of being and it wasn't a rule, as I found. Most of the things that were obstacles to me as a woman kind of working early on weren't because people were anti-women. They were just there because nobody ever really thought about it. That was a perfectly sensible rule that if somebody had gone off sick for 6 months or somebody had taken a leave of absence, why should we pay for their computer while they're not there? But it doesn't work. It's not the right thing to do if somebody's on maternity or paternity leave. That's just a tiny example. There's loads of examples of things that I found as I came through, because I was quite early on coming through, that made it more difficult. And all of those things have now, by and large, disappeared. You still get a kind of expectation. Unfortunately, there still is a kind of an expectation that if you walk into a room, the men are more senior than the women. And I think it's going to take a little bit longer for people to realize that, not only is that not always true, but sometimes if you make that assumption, you can end up looking very silly, because sometimes the most senior person in the room is the woman. And you're not going to impress anybody if you make the kind of assumption that, that it's the other way around. That's still going to take time. I mean, actually, that still pervades today. But I think the world is a much more positive place. Both, the expectations that couples have, the expectations that women have, the way in which work supports women who want to work has all kind of changed. It's very interesting. I remember at one point, I have a daughter who's now 20. And at one point I said to her, when you get older, are you going to work? And she just looked at me as if it was the bizarrest question in the world. Why on earth would I ask her this question? And I just realized that for her, this isn't even a question. Of course she's going to work. Of course she's going to have a career. Why on earth would she not? And it was me being silly that I would actually ask her the question. And I'm sure she'll have a great career. But it was kind of interesting because when I was her age, people were asking me that question all the time. And now the world has changed a huge amount.
Yeah, to the positive, hopefully to the positive. You mentioned, while you were speaking, you mentioned that you had to fight at McKinsey that they don't take your computer away while you're on maternity leave. There is one question, I think this goes back to resilience. Also, Elon Musk writes in his biography, I think it's part of the Elon Musk algorithm, question every requirement constantly and change the processes and take out what's not necessary. And you said you fought against this requirement at McKinsey that they take your computer away. The usual answer, I think, in big corporations, I was also in M&A at public companies, and the usual answer is when someone questions the requirements in traditional businesses that are run for decades, and then the young guy comes in and asks the question that no young guy should ask, why do we do it that way? And then starts drilling down into first principle thinking and say, why? Some people get quite annoyed. How do you respond to that reaction when you see a requirement that's not necessary? You start asking your questions and you feel that people start getting annoyed and they don't want to change it, but it costs a lot of money. How do you deal with that situation when they respond negatively to your inquiry? Let's call it that way.
Well, I think in most organizations, one of the things that you need to figure out really early on is what is the thing that makes this organization change? And it varies by organization. So in some organizations, the best way to make them change is by, organizing, a kind of project and kind of proving that, what's being done today is not the right way to do it. We should do it the other way. In other organizations, you do it, organizations often bring in external people to kind of prove a change. There's lots of different ways to do it. In McKinsey is a very people-based business, and certainly was when I was there. It's become even bigger today, but certainly then. And what I realized was after I hit my problem with the IT department in this case, and they said, well, unfortunately, literally computer says no, you've got to give us your computer back. I went to the most senior woman in London, who was, more senior than me. And I told her, and she picked up the phone, rang the IT department. It was probably not a conversation that should be recorded because I think kind of quite a few swear words you used, and the policy was changed. But I knew if I went to her, and I only did it on that one issue, and it was clear enough, she would sort it, because that was the way to get things to change. In McKinsey, is the partners had a huge amount of power, because effectively McKinsey is like a series of kind of entrepreneurs working within a system. But I think that the kind of broader way to do this is that in any organization, you need to figure out, how do I make change happen in this organization? And the answer is quite kind of organization specific. In a startup, it is it's very much around kind of people, and there's a real kind of openness to change. In kind of bigger, more kind of corporate organizations, it's harder, but generally a big part of the solution is finding a coalition. You as an individual, you can shout as much as you want about, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. If you're just a lone voice, you're not going to get anywhere. If you build a coalition of people, it's much harder to be ignored.
Yeah, that's true. I think this is one of the most interesting points in business, this striking the right balance between change and stasis. Economy changes, the universe changes. If companies don't go with the change, they will fall apart. But if they change too quickly, they will fall apart as well. So striking this balance, I think it's very interesting. When we talk about change, there is one buzzword, inclusion, inclusiveness, not only female leadership, but also would say different gender roles, being more open to also other gender roles, also being more open to ethnicity, also being open to people from different social backgrounds. How do you see the future of the economy? Is there still some work left, or is everything already at its best in the West?
No, I think there's definitely kind of more work to do. I mean, it's kind of interesting here. As a biologist, I guess I guess from if I kind of think of it as a biologist, there is a natural human thing where you tend to trust people who are more like yourself. And I think one of the things that we need to accept is that that is a natural human thing. We used to live in small communities, and people who lived outside of our community who are different to us, we always kind of regard with a little bit more suspicion. And kind of people who are more like us, we tend to trust a little bit more. Once you understand that because it's a fundamental part of the human condition, we're always going to have to try and stop ourselves from doing that. And we need to stop ourselves from doing that for two reasons. One is it's not fair. I mean, it's absolutely not fair. But the other reason is that the best talent is probably evenly distributed across all sorts of different people, different shapes, sizes, colors, genders, sexual orientations, backgrounds, that, the talent is kind of across all sorts of different people. And if we restrict ourselves to only hiring and promoting people of a certain sort, whatever that certain sort is, then we're kind of constraining the amount of talent that we can get into an organization. So we have to keep on fighting that kind of very natural human inclination to, trust people who are more like ourselves. I think kind of step one is admitting that that is a natural human condition. And step two is, I think we will have to kind of proactively keep on making sure that, for example, a big organization recruits from a wide range of different sources, that, when it has its internal schemes, that it makes sure that they are as open and accessible as possible to different people. I do think it'll get slightly easier over time. So I think as the senior people in organizations and on boards and so on become more diverse in their makeup, then it becomes easier for people coming up through the organization to see somebody who looks a bit like themselves further on. So that's a very good thing. I think the other thing is that it kind of teaches people that they shouldn't make assumptions about other people. So as I say, kind of early on in my career, quite frequently it was assumed that because I was the woman in the room, and often I was in a room with mainly men, I was therefore the most junior. As time has gone on and there's many more senior women around, that becomes quite a dangerous assumption for people to make. Well, likewise, if we live in a world where you might be very senior or very experienced or very knowledgeable, regardless of your kind of skin color or educational background or kind of gender or whatever it is, I think people will naturally be more inclusive in how they deal with people, because you've got to be, you don't want to end up kind of treating somebody in the wrong sort of way because you've made some sort of biased assumption about who they are. So the positive thing is, I think that this is all going to get somewhat easier as populations in companies become more diverse. The negative thing is, I think this is something that we will have to keep on worrying about, because it is a natural human condition to be more trusting of people who look like ourselves, and we shouldn't pretend that it's any different. That is a normal thing, and therefore we have to keep on, if you like, forcing ourselves not to be like that.
Yeah, you mentioned biases, conscious and unconscious biases and assumptions. And our conversation when I discovered the post from Francesco on LinkedIn, and where he wrote about your speech at his venture fund. I thought I would like to talk to you. I would like to understand better your approach to investing and what Exor is doing and stuff like that. And then you wrote back that you would rather talk about your book. I said, I'm totally fine about it. And you said it was a challenging childhood in your post. And then I thought, yeah, when she's CEO, so how challenging can that be? And then about your book. And I thought, you gotta be kidding me. It's about sailing. So what do I get here? It's a book about sailing, and why should that be difficult? Isn't it fun to sail around the world? And then read the book, and it reminded me of my own biases. That I say, okay, I tend to put people into boxes immediately. So I saw your role, and you're in that box. Oxford, Cambridge, in that box. Challenging childhood, sailing can't be challenging. I like sailing, so why should it be challenging? Um, can you explain how biases can be problematic in companies and what management and employees can do to fight biases in a way that the company doesn't fall apart?
Well, I mean, biases can be problematic in lots of different ways. First of all, as I say, there's people biases. So most companies will have, and even today, many companies will have a certain sort of person who works in a particular sort of company, whether that's people from the industry or more men or more women or people from a particular nationality or people from a particular type of educational background. I've come across companies where virtually everybody has worked at a particular university. Maybe they've come out of MIT or maybe they've come out of, some other kind of university. And there is a bias because you've got a group of people who are similar to each other. They can quite naturally begin to assume that people who don't come from that background, who, by the way, may therefore be less good at some of the things that they're good at, that those people are worse. They're going to be ineffective. And that, I think, is a very dangerous way to think, because there's lots of evidence, actually, that when you have a group of people who actually come from very different backgrounds, they're more willing to challenge each other. You're less likely to have groupthink. If you've got a bunch of people and they've all kind of been educated, in engineering at MIT, they're all going to think in a certain sort of way. And then if you put somebody else into that group who comes from a very different kind of background, they're going to have different things that they're worrying about. Maybe they're less worried about, detailing the process and getting that very clear, which, by the way, is a very good thing to do. But they may actually come at it in a very different way and be much more worried about what the culture of an organization is or whatever. I don't know. I'm making wild assumptions here. But the point is that as you mix up these groups, generally you tend to get to better outcomes. But you also, it's more painful in the short term. I mean, we all know what it's like to be in a group where everybody in the group is like ourselves. It's actually quite easy. Everybody's busy agreeing with each other. But in a company, that's not very healthy. So that's a kind of bias. But of course, there's other biases as well. There's a kind of bias in a company that, because we've been very good at doing this, we're not going to do that. And we all know the kind of famous examples of companies that were unable to pivot, the kind of famous kind of Blackberries and kind of all those who found it very difficult to pivot from one way of doing business into a new way of doing business. And that's very dangerous. So there are all sorts of biases that people have, even very clever people in organizations. And I think one thing actually a board can do sometimes, because they're not as embedded in the organization, is they can look out for and spot and call out some of those biases.
There's one part I would like to dive deeper. I mean, you have probably seen in your career a few hundred, if not thousand companies. Um, you have a really diverse career. And when I look back to business school, um, it was quite a simple story. Lifetime of a company starts, matures, and then sometimes it vanishes. And then when I look at the economy today, we have these outlier companies like Apple, like Microsoft, like Amazon, like also Nvidia. Meanwhile, whenever I think they are done and expect that the company will vanish, they find something new and they pivot and they manage to pivot. And others don't manage to do that. From your experience with the variety of company that you have seen, what makes the difference in leadership? Why do some companies successfully implement a culture of innovation and can innovate and innovate and innovate and keep innovating and keep growing like Apple, Amazon? And why do other companies fail? What's the huge difference? Can you boil it down to a few simple rules?
I don't know about simple rules. I mean, I sometimes call them kind of phoenix companies. They
Mhm.
kind of re-emerge after the fire. And they reinvent themselves. I mean, at Exor, when we're looking for companies, we look at companies not just that perform well financially, but we also look for companies that are sustainable, because that's important, but also companies that are innovative, and that they have created, a moat. They're distinctive. So they're distinctive and they're innovative. And I think if a company is going to be around for a long time, as a culture, the management needs to put as much emphasis and reward and attention on innovation and distinctiveness as they do on the kind of short-term results. And the danger, of course, particularly if you're a public company where you're being kind of driven by quarterly kind of earnings, is what you're really worried about is what's the next lot of numbers that I'm going to present. And by the way, that's not a bad discipline, it's a good discipline. But where it can become dangerous is if that means that you're not putting emphasis on kind of innovation and distinctiveness and sustainability as well. And so one of the jobs, I think, for a CEO and the leadership team and for a board is to try to kind of make sure that the company is, doing as much on those longer term issues as the shorter term issues. And it's the companies that lose sight of that, I think, that end up in trouble. I mean, I never kind of worked inside kind of Apple, but I imagine, I would hope, I'd be surprised actually if it wasn't the case, that the conversations even at very senior level are as much about what they're developing for 3 years time as they are about what the sales are today and next month and at the end of the quarter.
Yeah, I find Apple is quite an interesting example. In 1987, it was close to bankruptcy. Then Steve Jobs came back. Tim Cook joined. I read his biography, so this is very good information. Tim Cook joined Apple. Microsoft, interestingly, invested in Apple, and then they created this huge success story. And I think this is a few important parts. I think it also boils down to, comes back to diversity. So when you have people from diverse backgrounds in a company, you can look at problems completely differently than when hiring just from one social group or from one gender group.
Yeah, I agree. I think it makes a huge amount of difference. And I do think that diversity helps a company to be kind of innovative. And also when you've got a more diverse group of people, I think people are more likely to ask the questions, the uncomfortable questions. It's all very well, we're doing fine, but I don't see what we're going to be doing in 3 years' time. How are we still going to be interesting in 3 years' time?
Yeah, when I was at the fraternity as a student in the 90s, it was mid-90s, the uncomfortable question doesn't make you friends. And when I addressed that, an older manager said, you don't have to make friends. It's just, just have to work together and have to make sure that the company thrives. And that's all, that's enough.
Yeah. These things are not a popularity contest. You need to build relationships, and people need to trust you, and they need to respect you, and you need to respect them and trust them. But you don't fundamentally. It's not about kind of building friendships. It's about getting a company to work, and sometimes, in order to do that, you've got to ask difficult questions and make yourself a bit unpopular.
Oh yeah, one of my female bosses was excellent in that. And one time in a meeting, in a one-to-one meeting, I asked her why she's so aggressive to these guys. And she looked at me and said, look, I mean, if you want to be liked, then you should go to marketing, work in marketing, because people are much more likable there. If you accept bad habits in a company, and this also gets back to diversity and biases, if you accept bad habits in a company, they grow. And if you let the bad habits grow, the company can fall apart, stops innovating, it stops moving forward, and you have to ask the uncomfortable question. I think this is how you addressed it also as a board member, ask the uncomfortable question. One uncomfortable question we addressed, maybe we can shine more light on that. It's children, education and children. I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done. When you had only to choose 3 points that you would recommend with your expertise from your policy work to European governments, what we should change in the world so that every child on this planet gets access to education, what would these 3 measures be?
So the first one would be, and it's quite interesting actually, I'm trying to do a little bit of kind of campaigning around this. There has been a huge surge in the number of children who've been taken outside of formal education. not just on boats. Boats is quite a small thing, but homeschooling has become a huge thing, both in Europe and in the US. So my first thing would be, we need to know what's happening with all of these children. At the moment in the UK, for example, we don't know who's being homeschooled. We don't even have a register of it. If you're taken out of the system, we don't know. And if we don't know, we have no chance of ever trying to work out whether or not they're getting any sort of decent schooling. And also, because nobody goes to see these children or contacts them in any way, because there's no requirement to do so, there's no way that anyone can raise the alarm if things are going wrong. And I should add, many people who are taking outside of the children are taken outside of the system, it may work absolutely fine. You know, they may have a great time, they may get a great education. The thing is, we just don't know. And that for me is very worrying, given my background. So my first plea would be, you know, let's at least kind of know where our children are and how they're being kind of educated. The second thing is, I think governments trying to create access to these new forms of education and making that access as wide as possible would be incredible. So even if you're going to a school which is not a great school, or you are, you know, outside of the system, or you are just in a school which doesn't offer a subject that you might be fascinated by. Maybe you're in a small school, but you're fascinated by coding. You know, it's now completely doable to make this sort of education widely available for children. And I think governments investing in that and supporting companies that do it, I think would be incredible and quite transformative. And then the kind of, I guess the third thing is, you know, children, you know, types of education do differ. In the UK, we put a huge emphasis on people going to university, but apprenticeships are just as powerful as well. And so we need to create various different routes and not just going to go down a kind of single route for education. Because if we do that, we will find some people who just don't fit very comfortably in a standard education setting, and then they'll just leave at a very early stage. So I think kind of tracking and knowing where the children are, making these new education forms available, and, you know, creating multiple different pathways for children to go down. All of those things I think would make a huge amount of difference.
Yeah, that's true. The internet is a blessing. So the second point that you mentioned resonated. I think buying a book, for example, growing up in the countryside, you were on a boat. I was in a small mountain town. Whenever I wanted a book, the local bookstore refused to buy it because finding that book somewhere on the planet meant a whole day of work. Then came Amazon, then came the internet, and there is so much possibility today to make education accessible. It's incredible, and policymakers can make a huge difference in that to make sure that children get the opportunity regardless of where they're living. It's simple things like making sure that children have internet and access to an iPad or to a computer. Not all children are rich. You balance a lot of areas in your life. This is pretty amazing. So you had this amazing childhood, this incredible childhood on a boat, then went to the top universities, worked for McKinsey. We talked a lot about your professional life, but you also have a passion for the arts. How do you balance that, professional life and arts? What role does it play in your life?
Well, one thing that happened is when I came back off the boat and I came to London, that was when I first really discovered music. Because on the boat, we had very limited music. We were still in the age, as you mentioned before, where you had tapes. And my mother had a Dolly Parton tape. And my father had he had a kind of he had a tape. I think he had a kind of Bob Dylan tape. I think I had an ABBA tape, and my mother had a kind of Hooked on Classics tape. And that was pretty much it. You know, those four tapes that just got played and eventually got very distorted, actually. So it was only when I came back to London that I actually discovered music. I went on a trip with a friend to Hungary, and we went to an opera, and that was the first opera I'd ever heard. And then I fell in love with classical music and opera. I love other sorts of music as well, but there is there is something very special about going to a concert, which you can do relatively cheaply as well. And I certainly find that for me, if I can go to a concert or an opera or a ballet, I just switch off. It's just a wonderful experience. I regret the fact that I can't really play an instrument. That's one of the downsides of growing up on a boat. I can't really play an instrument. And I have occasionally thought about doing that, but of all the things in my life that I need to make choices about where I spend my time, it's probably not the best place to do it. But I really enjoy that. Now, nowadays, I did have a phase where I was very involved at the Opera House in London. Since I've become more focused on some of these issues around education and public policy, I've kind of shifted a bit of my time across to that. But I still really enjoy going and just listening to music. It is a wonderful experience. And I feel very privileged to live here in London, at least be based here in London, where there's so much music you can go and listen to.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. What kind of music do you like the most?
It depends on what, as it were. So I actually like lots of different sorts of music, but it depends really on the circumstance. I love going to a kind of classical music concert, but I also quite enjoy kind of, pop music as well. I don't mind that at all. I'm actually going, Iveco, which I chair, is doing a whole collaboration at the moment with Metallica.
Really?
So I'm going to a Metallica concert in a few weeks' time.
May I ask, did you understand that one of your companies is doing a collaboration with Metallica? Metallica, the metal band. So One and Justice for All, I think, was one of the records. Why? How?
Well, this is Iveco, so Iveco trucks.
yeah,
I think for them, doing a collaboration with a heavy metal band, and they're a truck company, fits. A lot of their truck drivers love Metallica. And actually, Metallica is also a very environmentally conscious group. And so we are providing Metallica with very environmentally conscious trucks, kind of electric trucks. So we're supporting the band in their European tour. So, we're providing them with trucks. They are kind of working with us in terms of, the messaging around kind of Iveco. So I think sometimes these kind of creative partnerships between a company and, an artistic group, in this case, kind of Metallica, can be incredibly powerful. It's also very motivating for the staff and the people in the company.
Yeah, I believe that. I mean, Metallica is a great band back
right.
80s, 90s. Also a great success story. It's also, I think, a story of resilience, pushing through, going through hardships, sticking together, making music, continuing a lot of adversity. A great band. Love it. Love it still. When we look at the time, I mean, we are 10 minutes before 2 o'clock here. It's 1 o'clock, I think, in London. I'm almost at the end of my questions. Before I ask my last question, is there anything open that you would like to talk about on this podcast? Is there any topic that you would like to address that's important for you?
No, I think we've covered so many different things. It's been a lot of fun. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. I enjoyed this conversation, and it was unusual from the first minute where I met you online until to the end of this conversation. Then I come to my final question. You mentioned that you wrote 4 books, and it looks like a series of books. When will your next book come out? Do you have plans already?
I do indeed. So two things are happening. One is, I mentioned at the start that Wave Walker has been optioned for a mini series. So I'm very excited about that. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. But I'm actually starting to write my next book. So one of the things that happened after Wave Walker came out, and Wave Walker has been very successful as a book, which is wonderful. But one of the consequences of that is lots of people have reached out to me who had very extreme childhoods of their own. So lots of people who grew up on boats, but also people who were homeschooled or dragged across America on a cycle or across Africa or whatever it might be. And so my next book, I think, is going to be a collection of some of those stories. And I think it's going to be fascinating because some of these stories, they are incredible stories of these things that happened, but they also say something because these stories don't always end up in the same place. You know, some of them are very positive stories. The person kind of comes out of it in a very positive way. Some of them they're very negative, and I think we can actually draw quite a lot from that. But fundamentally they're great stories. So I'm really excited to try and figure out a way to tell them in a compelling manner. It's going to be an interesting writing challenge, which I'm looking forward to.
Send me an email. I would love to read that book. I enjoy reading your book. I still have a little bit more, a little bit less than half to go. I will definitely finish it. It's a great book. It's very well written, if I may say so, as a non-native speaker. I enjoyed every minute. I actually bought the ebook, the hardcover, and also the audiobook.
Oh, wow,
It's a
great.
great combination. Um, Thank you very much for your time and for the insights in your childhood, your insights also into business, into investing, entrepreneurship, also into heavy metal, Metallica. I loved every single minute of it, and it would be great to stay in touch.
It would be. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon. Have a great day. See you soon. Bye.